Okay, excellent. Great to see so many of you here today, and hello everyone. And thank you for joining our EIA community event, Digging Deeper for Net Zero. My name is Ethne Childs, and I'm Communities and Partnerships Lead at the Institution of Environmental Sciences, or IES, and I'm going to be chairing the meeting today. So this event is going to provide lightning provocations to support a wider consideration of what is involved in achieving net zero in development. The provocations will explore often under-considered greenhouse gas emissions related to a project, including heritage assessments, digital-related emissions, construction, and downstream emissions. It's really designed to get you thinking about different aspects that may impact emissions from a project and the implications that this might have for net zero. This is designed to be an interactive event, and it brings together specialisms working in environmental impact assessment, planning, heritage, and the wider environmental sciences to explore how we can gain a more holistic understanding of the carbon emissions from the entire life cycle of development. By bringing together professionals across specialisms and disciplines, we hope to share ideas, inspiration, and provocation as we work to improve our industry for the future of our communities and our planet. So, before we kick off, just a quick bit of background before we get started. For those of you who don't know us, the IES is a global professional membership body for environmental scientists working across disciplines and sectors. And within the IES, this event has been organised by Environmental Impact Assessment Community in collaboration with the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. The IES's EIA community provides a forum for thought-provoking, critical conversations around EIA from a science-based perspective. And just to say a few words about CIfA, I'll pass over to Alex.
Thank you, Ethne. Hi, I'm Alex Llewellyn, and I'm the interim co-CEO for CIfA. And as Ethne said, I'll just give you a very brief introduction to CIfA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and our climate change working group. So CIfA is the professional home for archaeologists working in the UK and overseas, and we provide a forum for sharing knowledge, learning, and skills development for our members. And we set high standards and benchmarks for good practice in archaeology. We promote the archaeology profession and the value archaeology brings to society, to the wider heritage sector and other sectors such as construction and planning. And we provide the lead voice for the profession, influencing decision makers and keeping archaeology on their agendas. Our member-led climate change working group was established in 2020, and the aim of that was to provide advice on how archaeologists can reduce carbon emissions, encourage members to share their own ideas and case studies, and seek expertise and examples from outside the profession to support our understanding. And the group's created a carbon reduction guide table, a range of conference sessions and discussions and training events, and has set up an online heritage carbon reduction network using the Knowledge Hub platform as ways to share information. And all information about this can be found on our website, and I'll put a link in the chat in a minute if you're interested in having a look. And we're really pleased to be part of this session with the EIA community and to benefit from these wider discussions of the shared experiences and challenges that we're all facing around carbon emissions and carbon reduction.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, it's great to be working together with CIfA, so really excited to get these conversations going. Just a quick overview of the agenda today. So very brief, but you can see we've got the introductions, and we will then hear from our four speakers who I'm going to introduce shortly, and they're going to provide their lightning provocations, exploring different perspectives on net zero and factors to consider. And as you'll notice, the event today has been set up as a meeting rather than a webinar. And this is really in order to allow for it to be more interactive and allow for discussion. So with this in mind, I can see some of you are already doing this, which is great, but please do introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your area of work. Just one thing is that when people are presenting, as it's a meeting, if you could make sure that you're muted when other people are speaking, just to reduce background noise and distraction. But of course, when we go into the discussion, you can, of course, turn that back on so we can see everyone's faces, which would be lovely. You might have noticed that we're recording, but don't worry, the discussion's not going to be shared anywhere. This is just for note-taking purposes, and I will delete the recording after those notes have been taken. I do plan to publish a summary of discussion points after the event, and I can keep you informed of that. When we do get to the discussion section, please use the raise hand function. You can usually find that at the bottom of your screen if you would like to comment or ask a question. Alternatively, you can also write these in the chat box. As this is an emerging area and an interactive event, please do make sure you get stuck into the discussion later on and let us know what you think about key considerations for meeting net zero in planning and development. Without further ado, I'm really pleased to now introduce our speakers for today. A massive thank you for them for taking the time to be here. First up, we will hear from Kate Tandy. Kate is Head of Litigation and Casework at the Office for Environmental Protection and is going to be talking about the Finch case. We will then hear from Dan Phillips, Hertfordshire County Council's Leeds Manager, to talk about heritage assessments. Then Claire Boardman, a technologist and archaeologist whose current focus is on transformational engagement and the reuse of archaeological and heritage data to inform contemporary responses for environmental and social challenges. And finally, from Alan Chandler, senior academic at the University of East London, to talk about low carbon construction. A massive thank you to all of you. I'll stop sharing and hand over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Ethne, and great to see everyone. I should start, as I've already said to Ethne, feel somewhat of a fraud being here. I am a lawyer. I'm not a practitioner. I have never had to conduct an EIA. So I will just give you a bit of an overview of the Finch case, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of, and then think a little bit about the impact of that case, both on fossil fuel projects, where we've seen the most impact so far, and then I'll kind of be leaving you with a slight question as to kind of what else it might be relevant to in the EIA space. Just as a recap, as I say, I'm sure many of you are aware, the judgment was handed down by the Supreme Court in June last year, and essentially the question for the Supreme Court was whether in the context of a new oil development, whether it was necessary to assess the downstream emissions that would result from the eventual combustion of that oil as part of the environmental impact assessment. And so the question really for the court was, are those downstream emissions an effect of the project? And the High Court had found no, they weren't properly to be considered an effect, and in fact couldn't be. The Court of Appeal then sort of went for a little bit of an in-between option where they said that they could be in certain circumstances, but it was a matter of planning judgment for the relevant planning authority as to whether those downstream emissions were an effect of the project and therefore ought to be assessed. And then the Supreme Court had the final say in what was a split decision. So 3 of the 5 judges said that yes, the downstream emissions from a fossil fuel project of the eventual combustion are an indirect effect or an effect of the project, such that they should be assessed as part of the EIA. There was a strong dissenting judgment from Lords Sales and Richards, which would have returned back to the High Court position, which is that they're not. So that's just to say this was not a kind of straightforward, simple decision, but the law as it is now from the Supreme Court is that those downstream emissions are an effect and therefore need to be assessed. The main kind of reasoning for that in the judgment that was particularly important, I think, to those judges who were in the majority was the inevitability that of those downstream emissions occurring as a result of the project. So they were sort of alive to the kind of arguments about opening the floodgates. If you kind of have to assess those downstream emissions which you know haven't occurred directly from the project, where does it end? And I think they were particularly keen on keeping it close to the close causal connection between the fossil fuel being extracted and the burning happening, and the fact that the time and place of the emissions was unknown and was outside of the developer's control wasn't a reason for the downstream emissions not to be in effect, because the fact whether or not the emissions occurred was within the developer's control, because if they didn't extract the oil, then no burning would happen, and if they did, then it would. So I think it's kind of important to have that in mind, that I do think the inevitability was key in the Finch judgment. And I think generally speaking, perhaps outside of the fossil fuel extraction situation, the questions of likelihood of an effect and the significance of an effect will remain for planning authority judgment. But obviously, where you're talking about inevitable emissions, then they are more than likely. So just very briefly to sort of conclude, that we have now seen 2 other significant cases that have applied the Finch judgment, which one was in relation to the West Cumbria coal mine, where you know, that case is interesting for other reasons, which I don't have time to go into now. But on that point, it's very clear that those downstream emissions from the burning of coal should have been taken into account, despite the fact in that case, West Cumbria coal mine argued that there was an element of offsetting going on, but the court found no, you should still, as part of the EIA, assess those downstream emissions. And then similarly, you probably will have seen the outcome of the challenges to the Rosebank and Jackdaw offshore oil and gas fields licenses. And again, the Scottish court there, applying the reasoning in Finch, found that those downstream emissions should have been assessed, and therefore those projects can't go ahead until they are. So I think that the question then, there's been some guidance which the government is working on and has published to as to how you should assess downstream emissions in the oil and gas industry. I think the bigger question for lawyers, and I'm sure there will be, I know there are various cases that might be coming up, as to what does this mean for downstream emissions not from fossil fuel projects. And I think that's a particularly interesting question, which I don't have the answer to, but I think that will be a useful thing to think about as to where does this idea of causation and inevitability start and finish. So I will hand back to Ethne, but I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kate. Such an interesting and developing area, as you say, around downstream emissions. So happy to explore some of that later in the discussion as well. Dan, if I could hand over to you, please.
Sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I will try to keep this provocation as lightning as I can. It's very timely because yesterday I attended an event in London on archaeology and renewables is fundamental to climate change and carbon. And what dawned on me at that meeting, and in response to, I work for a local authority, extreme, I would say, is not an underestimate of pressure on local authorities to deliver growth at all costs, is that a strong belief that the environment in all its guises, in all its ugliness, whether it be ecology, archaeology, suds, whatever, landscape, is absolutely a pillar of delivering on climate change and delivering sustainability for our communities for the next 100, 200, 300 years. And that has to be core in our belief going forward. But in terms of archaeology, and we're dealing with EIA and assessment, it's important to also note that this is the whole life of the assessment. This is not just the digging or the desk-based work, but the whole life. And the sector has been reacting and proactive very, very forcefully, actually, in addressing two things, really, our own carbon emissions and how we can reduce our carbon emissions, how we can tie ourselves into that growing agenda, but also then how we can, through sustainability, we can influence developments coming forward to be more sustainable and ask that question of who will be being sustainable for, what does sustainability look like? One of the areas that Hertfordshire have been tapping into is, and it's very relevant, is that idea of solar farm development, which is massively on the increase. From 2015 to 2019, we saw 752 applications. That's for renewables, not just solar, in England. Between 2019, so it's 2015 to 2019, between 2019 to 2024, that's increased to 3,450. So we're seeing a 5-fold increase in renewable development, and the solar sector believes that's going to quadruple in the next decade. So there is massive potential there, but also there is a recognition that type of development may be different. It's it's producing clean energy. What can archaeology do to work with that type of development to reduce its own carbon, also to facilitate that development? So one of the things we've been looking for in Hertfordshire, and we're not alone, other districts, other councils have been doing the same, is can we improve the non-intrusive, low-carbon elements of work? So the desk-based assessments, the desk-based research, the direct, the geophysical survey, the field walking, those sorts of things. Can we provide more information up front to inform better, more precise decision making about when those heavy carbon intensive elements of digging the ground and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere happens? Okay, and so we're trying to look at, and you know, archaeology, it's important to caveat that archaeology and the advisors to archaeology don't, you know, every case is individual, and everything is warranted. They don't throw things around willy-nilly. But you know, excavation is important. It's a way that we can understand, characterize that, not just that impact, but the significance of that impact from that particular solar development. But can we start to be as precise as possible in what we dig and when we dig it, to limit that excavation, limit that amount of carbon that's being released, and thus working with that notion of sustainability and in a climate an awareness of climate change. We've got a couple of sites in Hertfordshire where we've done, we've worked that, we've tried to look at that process. It's been challenging because we've had to get all of our districts to buy in, who ultimately it's the districts that make the decisions, to buy into those concepts. We've had to build fail safes in so that if, for instance, we have, generally speaking, with excavation, it can become, in planning, it can happen both before and after planning permission has been granted, and we have tried to look at methods to, where possible, and obviously it's not always possible, push that excavation once development consent has been granted, so that, for instance, from a developer's point of view, they know that they've got consent, they know that they can go to their banks, backers, or whatever, and get the resources to be able to see that project through. You know, that's a contentious issue in archaeology, and it's one that, you know, yesterday was debated quite heavily at this event. If that is the case, it's all about managing risk. EIAs are all about risk, and how can we as advisors ensure that if that is undertaken at a particular stage, that risk, that the stakeholders are aware of that risk, and that we have some element of control over that risk. And that's what we've worked with our planners to ensure, things like bespoke conditions. We're not a statutory function in the planning system, but to raise our level of input to a level of almost a statutory function, by caveating bespoke conditions that allow us to have much more input later on. That's where we've sort of looked, where we're exploring. We're now moving into a process of looking at how we can improve the front-loaded elements. We've already researched geophysical survey. By, you know, the standard is magnetometry, let's say, across an open field. It's quick, it's easy, it's cheap. But can we then focus in, hone in on different types of techniques that are more expensive to help identify that archaeology? We're now starting to explore the desk-based research and how we can potentially improve that, because the quality of that varies greatly. Thank you very much.
That's excellent. So thank you so much, Dan. A lot of really interesting food for thought there around net zero and heritage assessment. So thank you. And I can see some questions are starting to come through, and we will address these later on. So thank you for putting them in. Same, if you have any for Kate, please do put them in the chat. Claire, if I could hand over to you now, that would be great.
Great. Thank you, Ethne. I hope you can see that okay.
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Right, great. Okay, hello everyone. I'm here to talk about digital aspects in 5 minutes, probably about 4 minutes now. But the first thing I want to point out that digital has not and never has been and never will be environmentally friendly. Until we have very different technologies, it never will be. And the only thing we can look at is mitigation. I did a little bit of searching this morning, and current estimates are that computing, so that's across the computing life cycle from manufacture right through use to stop using them, is about 2 to 4% of global emissions. Now, you might think that doesn't sound too bad, but when we start comparing, that's in some reports, that's actually greater than the aviation industry. And as you can see from my slide on the left-hand side, where the big tech is listed there, you can see that the big tech are putting out more emissions than nation states. So it's not a great situation. But people are constantly researching and working to improve the environmental performance of digital. And there is hope from that, but things have changed recently. And with the massive introduction of artificial intelligence, the data centers that are required to support that, and especially when we see things around generative AI, they're currently making up over 3/4 of all computing emission, and that is set to grow at alarming rates and eye-watering percentages that I'm not even going to tell you, because we'll just go into analysis paralysis and get no further. So what I'm going to stick to today, and very quickly, is actually just wander through some ideas around digital waste within our practices. So bringing things a bit closer to home and a bit more in our control. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is really about our behaviors and our habits, our digital habits when we're working, and ideas around purchasing really, and redundancy. And do you habitually, or your organization, are you buying the same equipment over and over again because you're a Mac house, or I only do Windows, that's all I know, that's all I can work with, because that could be slowing you down if you're not looking at things like alternate and more environmentally friendly operating systems, for instance, like Linux, which will extend machine lives and slow down that redundancy and the amount of times you have to buy new equipment. But also, do you have, looking at your own practices, do you have good project close down digital procedures in place? Or, do you have procedures where you will go and delete files or applications from live systems that are no longer needed? And do you have procedures in place that gets files off live systems and into longer term storage that are only powered up when needed? And a good old one, do you switch out the light but leave PCs and other equipment switched on and permanently charging because that's just what you do and you've always done? Things to think about. The next one is a big one, actually, is the duplication. And we're all guilty of this. We're all guilty of having multiple copies of multiple files and applications sitting on our machines, our drives, or our backup storage, or super emergency storage, and it goes on and on and on. And I'm as guilty as the next on this, especially with massive GIS files. But is there space here to challenge ourselves and ask, well, are we doing this because we have the multiple versions of things around rather than actually using a good version control tool? Are we handing off digital files to our team members and other teams around the project rather than using collaboration tool? Are we keeping local copies just in case, again, just in case something happens, rather than having trustworthy backup and disaster recovery processes in place? And just on the right-hand side, this is not pointing the finger at those organizations. I just had to grab very quickly this morning, but I just want to point out that this is a sector level issue as well. We have information and data stored throughout the system. You know, we might have our own copy. We have a copy with the local authority. We have something perhaps with the Archaeological Data Service, and it goes on and on and on. And I'm not sure that we actually know what we've got in the sense of where the overlaps are, what versions we have, etc. So I just thought I'd put that in. It's a local problem, but it's also a sector-wide problem. And just finally, digital over design. I know they're beautiful and I know they're fun, but there's something about fit for purpose here, and whether and basically doing the minimum we need to do and optimizing our processes. So we're just doing what we have to do to deliver the goods, whether that's to support a decision, to do engagement, whatever that is, to just challenge ourselves. If we have 3D, will 2D do? If we have 2D, will text do? Do we need video? We'll still do the job just as well. I think there's also, I see in our sector, there's this fear of missing out, and I see that quite a lot. And I've put the AI back in there because that is coming out as quite fast and furious. But it's a challenge to ourselves to not jump in too soon before we can see exactly what these technologies can do for us. And if we do jump, to implement them only when necessary and where needed. So that's supported by, you know, great process analysis and operational measurement, and support from trustees, directors, that, you know, to give people the power to say no or no, not yet. And I'm going to stop there.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. That's great. Again, a lot of things to think about, especially with the kind of rise of the new digital methodologies that we're seeing at the moment, especially for EIA. So thank you so much for that. Alan, if I could hand over to you now. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much indeed. I'll share my screen and hopefully it will not be too painful for everybody to have this transition. Is that working?
It's just loading now. Yep. Yeah, I can see that. Thanks, Alan.
Okay. So I'm an architect, not an archaeologist, so I'm not going to teach you all to suck eggs, but archaeology is used to reading materials, and we can see that list. These are the things that you kind of do on a day-to-day basis. But do you read things politically? Because carbon is essentially a very political thing, and I'll just put a little example out there that we can talk about. Let's take a brick. I'm working in India at the moment on low carbon project, and I thought I'd share some of the stats with you so you can kind of see some of the scope of what we're talking about. So this is an Indian brick. 15 million rural poor people made 20 billion bricks in 2024. That's when they're not harvesting sugar. When they're making bricks, there's no social or healthcare. It's effectively bonded labor for women and children. They work 14-hour days, and they rely on money lenders because they get paid at the beginning of the season, and then their money runs out. So this is a kind of an interesting kind of carbon cycle, if you like. Each kiln owner, and I've been there and seen these people, they're actually effectively squires, and each workforce are basically serfs. So this is back to the 17th century in the UK. So there's 140,000 kilns, and they produce around 1.5 million bricks per firing. And as we can see, it's very manual labor. So to fire the bricks, coal dust is fed every 10 minutes of every hour of every day into kilns, and they're burnt. And they co-create the world's second most polluted city, which is Delhi, which sits bang in the middle of India's brick and sugar heartland, which is the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So to do this job, you get $5 for 1,000 bricks. You can kind of see 1,000 bricks in the background. So the interesting thing about this is that one would assume that things would become mechanized, but in fact, people are cheaper than mechanization. And while they can just about eat enough to do the work, why spend the money on machines? So we're looking at a kind of tale of two industries in this. We're looking at sugar, we're looking at brick. So my project is effectively bringing the two of these sort of productive industries, neither of which are very good, together. So effectively what we're doing is we're setting a thief to catch a thief. And the answer is to put the two together, is to use sugarcane waste, of which there is quite a lot, to create biobricks. So we're looking at replacing the entire firing industry, all of that carbon, all that content, back, get rid of it, and produce carbon negative, insulating and clean technology. So why sugarcane? Sugarcane is the world's largest crop by volume. Last year, there was 623 million tons of sugarcane waste. When you crush the cane, you get these fibers. It's called bagasse. And that provides you enough material to make enough bricks to replace the entire global brick industry, which is 3 to 4% of global warming potential. So how much waste? Just as a picture, you get 20,000 kilos per second being produced globally. That's 72 million bricks, which are taking place during me speaking. So that's around 10,000 80 square meter houses. So the interesting thing about sugarcane is that it absorbs CO2 50 times faster than forestry, and it uses 23 times less land to produce the same volume of material. So relying on trees to save the planet is probably not going to work, because you have to wait at least 30 years, and the quality of the timber is terrible. And you're only using around about 30% of the tree when you're actually building it into buildings. So the task for us was to find ways of making this affordable for people, and we started to look at carbon credits. So that's where the life cycle analysis, and preferably a dynamic life cycle analysis, comes in. And we have examples where we can get between $30 and $60 per ton sequestered CO2. Now that could be used to fund rural Indian worker co-ops to begin to transition away from fired coal and through to these cast blocks, which have no burning potential. Each single-story building using our bricks instead of fired clay ones would save around 120 tons of CO2. So you get a sense of how much investment you can bring into that sector if you go the carbon credit route. So as far as this technology is concerned, we've finished our first building in India. We're designing a second one at the moment. We're building a community school. The idea for it was to make a sustainable skills hub. This is it under construction, and this is it in use. So it was finished, it got opened by an MP from the Indian Parliament last month. And our second building is a larger community school and training centre, which is in a city called Hisar, which is just 100 miles from Delhi. So the issue we have with sugarcrete and bricks is that actually materials are political. Bricks have effectively been weaponized in terms of the kind of the rhetoric of traditional India under the current government. And so it's very hard to puncture that. We have a political right that's effectively mobilizing class into a kind of recalcitrant and sort of militant status quo. So change is actually a threat, whereas in fact, it's probably the only way we're all going to survive. So our project is having to deal with the cultural identity of bricks before they've been buried and dug up by archaeologists, while they're still being manufactured. So we're looking at the kind of the narratives and the rhetorics around materials in order to try and create carbon transformation. So the thing that I always stick by is this guy, William Morris. He understood the value and the necessity of the political dimension within materials and the way they relate to culture, and the understanding that social value is essential when we're making an assessment of any kinds of materials. So what constructions, therefore, do we make, use, and abandon for the next generation of you archaeologists to dig up? So for us, the real question is, how do we begin to understand carbon, not just as a set of numbers, but also as something that's politically active, that has a very meaningful and profound effect on the way people work and live? And also, how do we acknowledge that in decarbonizing, we have to understand the equity involved in spreading that benefit, not just for the planet in its abstract sense, but also in terms of people and their daily lives? Thank you.
A massive thank you for all of our speakers today for those thought-provoking presentations. Really a lot to think about, and I think hopefully will have sparked off some new ideas amongst the attendees. And thank you to all our attendees as well for being so engaged and getting stuck into that discussion. It's been excellent. I just wanted to let you know that if you are interested in kind of getting involved in any future events or kind of carrying on the discussion, I've put my email address in the chat. So please do get in touch if you're interested in that. I also wanted to highlight thanks for our EIA community member, Coralie, who's been involved in organising this event, and our contact at CIfA, Alex, who have all helped organise and put this together. And you can find out more about the IES and EIA community on our website. In the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again to our speakers, and hopefully you can go and enjoy some of the sun now. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.